I am so excited and so honored to have with me these incredible educators and scholars, contributors to Latinx TV in the 21st century. Jim Miranda is assistant professor of English and media studies at Bentley University. His research and teaching focuses on the intersections of Latinx and indigenous literatures, narratives of immigration and border studies. He's currently working on a cross-disciplinary study of border crossing narratives, tentatively titled Border Transits, Desert Bridges and Networks. Jim's chapter focuses on the FX show, The Bridge. And in this particular work, in this particular focus, Jim teases out how it challenges televisual constructions of the border as dangerous in contradistinction to a United States that is safe, stable, and secure. Mauricio Espinoza is assistant professor in the Department of Romance and Arabic Languages and Literatures at the University of Cincinnati, where he's also affiliate faculty with the Niehoff Center for Film Media Studies. His scholarship focuses on Latinx pop culture, migration, Central American literary and cultural studies. He's also a translator and poet. In the chapter that Mauricio wrote for this volume, he examines how genres of drama and comedy shape the few representations there are of Latinx cops. So Law and Order, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, for example, are shows that Mauricio focuses on, really teasing out the complexities of how they construct Latinx and mainstream white culture. So with that, I want to just welcome both of you and thank you so much for being in the space with me here. I'm so excited that Latinx TV in the 21st century is actually happening. It's a reality.
Really?
Yay.
There you go.
So Jim, let me ask you out of the gate, why Latinx TV, media studies in general, and, finally, why The Bridge as a focus for you?
Yeah, so, well, I've always just been drawn to any kind of Latinx presence on the screen. Even when I was growing up, it was you could only find American Me and Blood In and Blood Out, these kind of shows. So that's always been an interest, just trying to see how Latinx is being represented on the screen in general. And so that's kind of what drew me to that. In terms of The Bridge, I just feel that it has this, it lands at a particular moment that is really interesting because, just to historicize it really briefly, Border Wars, which is this reality TV show, had just ended in 2013. The Bridge shows up at 2014, right as all this prestige television, what we call prestige television, is happening. Breaking Bad had just ended, and it really does try to get at some of the social issues that are happening on the border in a way that kind of The Wire might try to get at some of those social issues. And then right after it ends, Narcos comes out, right? And so so in some ways it's really aptly named as a bridge from these social issues and prestige television to the narco era of television in a lot of ways. And because it uses that as a focal point, which I can talk about more, but yeah, it uses the narco narrative as a focal point, even though it's adapted from a series where that's not part of the original. And so it uses that. And I feel in some ways it became a bridge for this kind of genre television.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Yeah, really, really interesting. Mauricio, how about you?
Well, in my case, I'm a big fan of police shows. So it's just in general, right? I've always really liked Law and Order and its different, iterations and universes that they've created. Shows like Criminal Minds as well. So a lot of that crime, procedural, and also the real crime solving type of shows. So just out of that is when I started looking at, over the past 20 years or so, since those shows became really, prime, big stars of primetime television, how, Latino characters were appearing in those shows. So at first it was mainly as, the typical criminal, right? As we have seen with the main stereotypes of Latinos on American television and media. But little by little, you started to see actually Latinos as main characters, even, the protagonists in some of those shows. Let's think of, Benjamin Bratt in Law and Order, the original Law and Order, right? That's one of those. And then during the 2000s, even more, right? Law and Order Special Victims Unit started to incorporate Latino characters after like 10 or plus years of not having any in main roles. So now we see that transition from only criminals, typically mass in a way that not even without a name, right? Just run-of-the-mill criminals to as extras almost, or focusing on that, Latinos as the ones who commit the crimes, to now seeing main characters, cops, lawyers, prosecutors, detectives, others. So that was very interesting to me to see why this is happening. Interesting transition, right, in the way that Latinos are being represented now, and then more and more in the 2010s. A bigger presence now, a more diverse presence with Afro-Latinos, women in those roles. Also diversity in terms of sexuality, sexual orientation as well. So a host of sort of intersectional representation there. And then when we were working on Latinx TV for this project, I thought that was just the perfect thing to focus on, with two of my favorite shows, Law and Order SVU and Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which I didn't know about until my daughters introduced me to it because I loved it. One of the favorite shows. So I started watching it and really fell in love with it for what it does in terms of representation in general.
Yeah, really amazing. Was there, now it sounds like in a way you've already shared some, moments of surprise coming to the work. What about once you were in the work itself, in the kind of focused interpretive work that you both do in your chapters? Jim, for instance, the bridge and the typical kind of expectation I have when I come to these kinds of journeys, these narratives, is that it's going to be yet another Latinx threat narrative, with a white protagonist that carries the day. But tell me your work, and were there surprises, and what were those surprises? Were there things that were kind of more of the same, etc.?
Well, it really breaks down on both sides of that question, because there is a lot of so for example, they try to address a major social concern of the femicide, which that happened in Ciudad Juarez, right? And they're trying to understand that they don't, and that just hasn't really been represented or discussed much on television. So to try to address such a complex issue alongside migration, alongside narcos, is trying to bring it all together in a really complex way. And so in that sense, it's attempting to get at that. And it does have, in some resonances with Mauricio's work, it does have Latinx police officers too, right? So it has that as well. And right at the beginning, it's Damian Bashir. It kind of plays with the idea of the corrupt Mexican cop, because he doesn't actually get corrupted, right? He actually doesn't take the money, right? And so it tries to kind of invert some of those stereotypes. But where it fails, and here building on some of the work that some of the research that I did, and also just kind of my own reading, it also fails in places. And so instead of focusing on, in terms of the femicide, why not focus on the activist women who came together to challenge and to call attention to that? And instead it foregrounds, the narcos, right? It foregrounds their narrative arc. And so in that way, there's good things, but there's also these kind of, I don't know if I want to call them failures, but shortcomings or ways in which it might have moved in a different direction. I think that gets at the question you were asking.
Yeah, wonderfully, beautifully. Mauricio.
Yeah, in fact, there were a lot of surprises, right? When I started doing the research for the chapter, because really I was just looking at what was going on in the in the 2010s with the shows that I was familiar with, and then digging into both the scholarship, uh, and then just the history of police shows in U.S. television. Uh, I would, my first recollection of any Latinx cop, sort of a recognizable one, was Eric Estrada in Chips, right? A Sponge. Late 70s, that was, the first one that I could think of that I was familiar with, and one of the, the most important ones in terms of that type of representation, right? But then, reading whatever I could find on the history of cop shows or police shows in the US, I could see that there were Latinx cops as early as television itself and those cop shows. So late 40s, Dragnet, one of the first and most successful detective shows that actually started in radio as a radio drama, and then as radio transition in the 40s to television. And basically they kept the same formats, they just added the visual aspects of it. Dragnet then became a TV show, and it had the Sergeant Ben Romero, right? Arguably the first Latinx cop on shows, right? Start from radio to television, that transition. So that was a surprise. I had no idea. Wasn't familiar with the show either, and so that was an interesting piece of information there with that, how long Latinx characters have been present in that type of genre, right? Of course, it didn't surprise me the fact that it was an Anglo actor who played Sergeant Romero, right? Because that was the typical thing that you'll find of non-Latinos playing Latinos during that time, right? And then the other thing was looking at studies of media representation, right? Which and the one that I found that was really helped to anchor my chapter, it was how, I could see that there were several shows, and even some of the main primetime shows like Law and Order, Criminal Minds, etc., that had several Latinx characters as in the main roles. So I could see that there was a lot there, but to find that actually Latinx law enforcement officers were one of the main roles given to Latinx characters at all in all of television in the US. About a quarter of all the roles came from law enforcement agents of some kind. The other quarter is as criminals. And so that find that basically almost half of all the roles in primetime TV that go to Latinos, which are not that many, as far as like speaking roles, right? They all had to do with crime in one way or another, whether as Latinx as criminals, which is not surprising. We've had that trend, and now also as law enforcement agents fighting that crime, and so then you take away crime shows, let's say, and you take away half of all the representation of Latinx characters in primetime television in the US. So that was a huge thing, and it really showed me that studying those shows was fundamental for studying just Latinx TV in general, because of how many roles it affords to Latinx actors and the construction of Latinx characters, right? On both sides of sort of the legal line, criminals or those who are trying to bust the criminals, right?
And I was just thinking about some shows like Shades of Blue and Hightown, where we have Latinas as the crime fighters, but of course they are negligent and or they are untrustworthy. In the case of Jackie Quinones, of course, also suffering from drug abuse, alcohol abuse, etc. But let me ask you both this question. In other words, like, right, the crime fighter is never just kind of a good guy. And when you have such a scarcity of representation of Latino, Latina, Latinx that becomes problematic, possibly. I don't know, Mauricio, how you would respond to that.
Yeah, for sure. So we have, in that case, we have, it was a great thing for representation to also have Latinas, right, in those small roles, like Jennifer Lopez in that case being that protagonist. But then you have the cop who's also a criminal, who's gotten busted for doing something illegal, and then has to do something to try to save her reputation. And we see that with several other characters, both male and female, right? And so that is problematic because, yeah, but it also shows that it is impossible to disconnect the criminal element from the representation of Latinos, because you might say, okay, so 24% of the characters that are appearing on those primetime shows are criminals. That's bad because that exceeds the percentage of Latinos who actually commit crime. So, you have an overrepresentation of a negative stereotype, of course. But another 24% or so are now cops. And because law enforcement agents in this country, have, despite of the issues that we've had with police shootings, etc., for the most part, they have a high regard in society, right? As somebody those who protect us, right? Protect and serve. And so we may see that as a good thing. We're transitioning away from Latinos as criminals to Latinos as law enforcement agents and main characters, right? As the ones who, the millions and millions of people who love crime shows and who watch them will identify with in those roles. But that thing that links them, regardless of crime. And oftentimes those characters, even the cops, let's say the good guys or the good gals, are also conflicted and deal, which is fine. It's fine to be conflicted, to be then a complex character, because you don't want flat characters, all good or bad all the time, because we're not like that in real life, right? But the fact that when it seems like we're making progress towards a more positive representation, or at least this more realistic representation, then the element of criminality comes in, and it sort of takes us one step back, right? And that, what I really like, and that happens in Special Victims Units, Law and Order, right? The Detective Amaro, right, is very violent and macho, and often breaks the law just as much as he protects those he's supposed to serve, right? And so that's his undoing in the series. That's what I like about Brooklyn Nine-Nine, that while it is a comedy, right, not a drama, it really gets away from those stereotypes and that sort of double-edged sword by creating, by having two Latinas, and then one that might fit that stereotype of the tough Latina who gets in trouble, but then the one that is like the role model. So it shows the reality that you can have both. You don't have to have just one or the other and just fall into that trap of just, the scarcity, but just the one-dimensional type of Latinx person character.
It also speaks kind of beautifully to Jim's earlier point in his work, where something like, the bridge with Damien Bichir has kind of relocates where complexity and tension is. It kind of realigns. It's a different access, right? What do you think about that?
Well, I think, when I started writing the article, I was really interested in genre, even though I wasn't able to kind of say as much as I wanted to. But I think genre plays an important part here because like, when Mauricio was talking about the complexity of characters, like neo-noir becomes really important, right? Because you have these characters who have to be flawed on some level. And so if you're having more Latinx characters playing police officers or law enforcement, then they have to be flawed, because that genre calls for a kind of flawed lawman, right? And similar, and I think both of our articles mentioned this on some level, how a lot of these shows kind of situate the kind of structure of the Western into the urban setting, which again involves kind of a flawed character a lot of times. And so I think genre comes into play a lot here in terms of thinking about how these characters end up in that way, right? How they end up, you know, towing the, like playing with that line between criminality and law enforcement. And in The Bridge, you know, the character who's a police officer from Mexico, he very much so is also like much less likely to follow the rules than the female counterpart in the United States who he's working with on the case. And so he's willing to skirt the rules more. And so you get this sense, and then it kind of also filters that through a kind of national lens too, right? So the nationality, you get nationality playing in there. And so that's some of the things that I thought were interesting about, you know, the series, right? It's because it's using the similar kind of structure, but then it's kind of playing with that by also adding an added tension of like national differences and how law enforcement works differently in two different settings, right? So that when they ask for records in you know, Ciudad Juarez, it's like, oh, we can't find those, or it's, you know, whereas in the United States, it's, you know, that's not an issue. So it's kind of also playing with that, and whether or not it's in some cases it's also, you know, somewhat reinforcing stereotypes of these national differences as well. So
really
yeah.
interesting. Let me push us a little bit along here, which is if you were, I know that you both bring this stuff into your classroom settings at the college level, but I actually want to kind of push us a little bit to think about what would you, if you were now talking with a high school teacher and they asked you, well, how can I bring some of the insights from your work in Latinx TV in the 21st century into my classroom? What might that look like? Jim, do you want to take this?
Sure. So, I mean, my article was really motivated, provoked by conversations with students in the classroom. That's how I start the articles, because I would teach border media, right, on some level, and then I would ask the students how, you know, describe the border, and, you know, dangerous, violent, criminals, you know, things like that is what they would say. And, you know, that wasn't necessarily surprising. But then I asked them, well, how do you actually, you know, come to these you know, these descriptions? How do you come to these perceptions? And most of them had never been to the border. And so when I asked them this question, they would often cite both fiction and non-fictional sources, and they're kind of bringing them together. And so one of the interventions I tried to make in the article was to try to think about representation differently, because we often think about representation in terms of accuracy, like, does it match? And I feel like that can go in circles when we probably should be thinking, I call it a representational framework in the article, but like, and so when I was talking to a high school you know, teacher, I would say maybe thinking about representation slightly differently, to think of it more structurally, right? Because I think then you can get at some of the more nuance in the ways that, you know, representation affects our perceptions. Because it's very often easy to find fault with like a representation and say, oh, well, it fails here, or it doesn't do this, or it missed that. You can see this really obviously when you see biopics or something like that, right? But I think in terms of, you know, if we want to really get at how it frames our perceptions, especially of the border in this case, you have to look at it both fictional and nonfiction. And you have to think about how they're working in tandem with one another. And so that's why I really liked The Bridge as that central point of like reality TV, right? The Bridge, which is trying to be serious and real and trying to really get at these issues on some level. And then Narcos, which becomes much more sensationalized violence to some extent. And so thinking of it in those terms, that's kind of how I would try to talk to a high school teacher to say, hey, but maybe when we teach representation, we need to teach it in a more complex way.
Beautiful. Mauricio.
Yeah, that's a great question, because not that long ago I was a guest speaker for a high school class in Columbus, Ohio, where I was invited, and at that moment it was the centennial of the creation of Zorro character, which we edited a special journal issue on this, Frederick, and so I did talk with those students about that. So it was and I love doing that whenever I have a chance. I love to be invited to high school classes or middle school classes or elementary school classes for that matter, because I've done a little bit of all of those with studies on media literature or with like poetry workshops, and it's always a treat. And I feel like as university professors, we also need to be in those spaces because those are our future students, right? So, and that talk in particular, the way we're, making Zorro as more than just this, historical character or kind of an old character in American media, right? But really very much present in the constitution of all superheroes today, that hugely popular because of the Marvel multiverse and everything. So I talking with the teacher and the students, asked them to look at those origins, the origins of Zorro in Joaquin Murrieta, in the 1800s, and the Mexican-American War, and that cultural clash, right, that happens right after, and how that complex history that's often not taught in those very schools, right, it helps us to understand the creation of a character like that, the first superhero of media in US media, right, and all the Latino connection then to Batman, for example. So that way of connecting something like that with something that the students obviously know and they're watching, right? The Batman movies, the Joker, the comics and the TV series, whatever that will be that they are, to see the connection, right? That without Zorro, there wouldn't be Batman, right? The creation of Batman is linked with Zorro as a precedent, a very important precedent for the looks and for the bio of the character, the double identity, all of that stuff. So that was something that they really opened their minds to exploring that possibility, that often what we see are, whether it's African American culture, Asian American, or Latinx American culture, as this minorities that are sort of on the fringes of American culture, right? That's sort of the official narrative, but that we are really, once we look at those origin stories, to use a term, from our media, that we have influenced everything and that we have been there always, right? Influencing history, media, characters, narrative, poetry, social movements, everything, right? And then, but you have to do a little bit of archaeological work of looking at those connections, how this film character from the silent Hollywood era of the 1920s, right? Like Zorro, then basically spawned our whole superhero narratives of comics and then TV and film that now are this huge industry, right? And such an important source of our pop culture knowledge and imagination, right? So that's one example that where
Beautiful.
and also I'm teaching a class next year on narratives of migration in Latin America, and I'm using a lot of film and TV. Something like The Bridge will be perfect for it, alongside novels and comics and everything. So I think to connect not just the high school students, but even some of our grad students who are very young, connecting with this kind of media, right, that they live in and breathe in all the time. It's important to expand from a novel, from poetry, also to a TV series like this, that we can explore all the different representational possibilities. I think that's crucial for the way we should teach now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. As we wrap this up, TV show, Latinx TV show that you're like particularly excited about today, Jim?
I think for me, the show that I think the pandemic put it on a hiatus, was Los Espookies, which was on HBO. It was just amazing. I can't. It was one of those shows. As soon as I finished watching it, I just started it again, and it was pure joy. Which I love some The Bridge was interesting. A lot of other shows are really interesting, but it challenged genre. It challenged representation. It's cross-border, but it's not like, victim / criminal. It's completely different. And so for me, that's the show that I hope also becomes a bridge to some new kinds of representation and some new ways of approaching Latinx people on TV.
So cool. Yeah. Mauricio?
Well, it's not continuing now, but Jorge Gutierrez's Maya and the Three. It's one that I was really excited. I love narratives have to do with Mesoamerica and Mayan and Aztec culture. So I've always welcomed all of those. That was a wonderful one. And not TV, but I'm looking forward to the next Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the Miles Morales, which I really like the way they've done it. And then, you know, in the fall, there will be the next one coming up. Not recent, but my favorite show, Latinx TV show, is El Tigre by Jorge Gutierrez as well. I love his animation, and that was from the early 2000s. But when having young daughters at the time who really loved that, and that was one of those first shows for kids that really like exploded into everything Latinx, everything, also Mesoamerican, playing with the mythology. And that's one that I still rewatch sometimes just for the pure joy of it, because just visually so, and it's so funny. I mean, it's just so funny.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
beautiful. I love all of those, all of the above. So, well, thank you both for the gift of your experience, your scholarship, your insight here, and for Latinx TV in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Frederick, for the invitation. And yes, go read it. It's wonderful.
Yes.
Yay.
Take care.
Bye-bye.